Ground rules, you can only speak if you're at the table, okay? If you want to say something, you come along up. Once you've said your piece, you've had a bit of a discussion, return and let someone else take a seat at the table. All sound okay?
Yeah.
So the topic we're discussing is why young people vote Labour and why they still will. I think a better kind of way of phrasing it is how do we secure the youth vote? You know, we know that young people are mostly left-wing. We see that FT article that shows people are staying left-wing for longer as they age. But how do we then convert that into votes and election victories? What do we need to do? So James, what do you reckon?
So I think this is a really interesting question, and I'm James Potts, by the way. I'm the chair of the Young Fabians, and I think for me what I find quite fascinating about this concept is that, you know, I think there's two key issues. One is home ownership, which, you know, I was with my friend Stephen yesterday, who has just bought a house, but he is 38 years old, and he was 37 when he bought his house. And we were talking about other friends who are sort of like a few years older than me, because I'm about to age out the Young Fabians, but sort of now people are kind of in their mid to late 30s in London when they're able to buy a property. And like Stephen and his partner Chris both like work full time, have had to save up, but they've also rented for quite a few years as well. And it's sort of that foregone like shot of like, you know, you don't have like the ability to build up a deposit because you're having to pay rent so much on certain issues. And I'm actually reading a really good book at the minute called The Heath by Hunter Davis, who was like the biographer of the Beatles. And he lived in Hampstead Heath in like the 60s. And one of the striking things about that is that he bought a house with his wife and he like rented somewhere for a couple of years, saved up the sort of £1,500 deposit and bought a house in Dartmouth Park for about £5,000. And this was in like the early 1960s, which, you know, a splendid book and a real love letter to Hampstead Heath, which I absolutely adore. But to me, that sort of signifies and crystallises this issue, is that, and I think probably a number of the speakers here would talk about home ownership as being the crux of this. So we've gone from a situation where in the 60s it was a few grand to buy, like, you know, a 3-bed house in Dartmouth Park, which now is probably worth 1.5, maybe 2 million. And certainly for, you know, if you're a young professional in London even who's sort of earning relatively okay amounts of money in the grand scheme of things, you're above the national income average. It's just unobtainable. Even when you like have a partner earning a similar amount of money, that seems to be unobtainable. So to me, I think the key part of that is home ownership, and I think the solution out of that is to simply build more homes, because, you know, there is too much demand and too little supply. And you know, I think you know, Rachel was talking this morning about a modern supply side economics. I think that might, you know, hopefully that will extend to house building, because by doing that, build more homes, you then lower the prices, and then it just makes it more affordable. But I mean, it's interesting. I'm sort of taking a very London perspective to that. Obviously, it'd be interesting sort of how it plans out over the rest of the country, and I think that leads me quite nicely to introduce Alex, who is, I'll let him introduce himself, but I'm going to hand over to him for his thoughts on
And
this.
sorry, just for the people who entered the room, so the way we're doing this is we're not going to do questions at the end. It's a kind of ongoing discussion. If you want to join in and say something, come to the top, take a seat at the table, say your piece, and then give it to someone else.
Yeah.
All right?
So I'm going to vacate, but yes,
Go away, James.
I'll be here.
Thanks, James, and thanks, Holly. So I'm Alex McIntyre. I was selected in December to be the prospective parliamentary candidate for Gloucester, and unless somebody corrects me, I think I'm the only young Fabian who's currently a parliamentary candidate. I'm looking at Chris here. Have you aged out the young Fabians? No?
How old are you?
28.
Oh,
You
there
were a
we
young
go.
Fabian!
I'm not the only PPC who's a young Fabian, so that's great. I guess going back to Holly's point about, you know, we know that a lot of young people do vote Labour, and how do we turn those people out? And that's something that I've been giving a lot of thought to over the past few months. And I think you can split those people into young people into three, I guess. First and foremost is young voters coming at 18. Voting is a habit. It's something that people do or they don't. And if you don't start young, all of the evidence tends to show that people then don't tend to vote later on in life. You've got to get people into the habit earlier. And how we do that? Well, there's lots of ways, but one of the key ways that we need to encourage when we are in government is education about politics in schools, what voting means. And there's a massive gap between, you know, some of the top schools in the country and your private schools and what they teach you about politics. I mean, I was fortunate, I went to my local grammar school and we did a mock election when I was at school, and actually that engaged me as a 13-year-old kid in what the general election was going to be. But I know in too many of our state schools, they don't get that education. They're not getting told the importance of politics to them and on their everyday lives. And we don't encourage people to get out and use their vote from a young age. So that's one thing we've got to look at. The second is tying politics. Politics is always tied into place, and the closer you feel tied into a place, the more likely you are to feel passionate about it, and more likely you are to then use your vote at an election. And young people now, more than ever in our history, move around from place to place and often feel separated out from their locale. And, you know, I lived in London for a number of years before I moved out. I'm now living in Gloucestershire. But I lived in 3 different constituencies in 3 years. And so you don't feel that sense, that attachment to the place that you're living in, particularly if you're going off to university or you're moving away from home and you're living in rented accommodation. You're unlikely to stay in the same street for longer, so you're less likely to get engaged on those local issues. And if you're not as engaged with the local issues, you're less likely, again, to vote. And I guess the final part is that third group of young people, and they're the kind of young people who say, politicians, they don't represent me, they don't understand what I think about. Whatever I do, nothing's going to change. And how we reach that group, again, that ties into our policy platform and how we speak to those people and understanding what concerns they have, and the fact that young people will have very different concerns in London, as James was saying, to Gloucester, although things like housing do cut across all of it, because, you know, genuinely affordable housing is something that comes up on the doorstep every time I speak to a young person in Gloucester, because the current definition of genuinely affordable housing is not genuinely affordable. So there's 3 different strands there of like different voter groups that we've got to look at, and how we turn those people out is a very difficult challenge depending on which group you're looking at. I have less of the middle group because we don't have a university in Gloucester. However, we do have a lot of that final group of people who've never voted. They don't know what politics does for them, and they don't think politicians represent them. And trying to reach that group is going to be a big challenge for me over the next couple of months.
Okay, any thoughts on that? I know you're from the north, aren't you?
I am
very,
indeed,
very different
yes.
to Gloucester. So, I mean, I'm a northern woman as well. So, what do you think the challenges are specifically in the north of England for young people? Are they different?
Yeah, so I guess I speak from 2 perspectives. So being a northerner and also being the director of the UK Democracy Network, we are working with the 900 or so organisations across the UK that are trying to improve politics and democracy itself. And so we have a number of organisations that are part of our network, such as the Politics Project, Shout Out UK, I Have a Voice, and these are projects that go into schools and that help young people understand politics. And at the same time, we've also got people like Labour Women's Network and a CNT Reaction Group that are trying to get more women to stand. And I talk about those 2 things because, one, you've got a representation issue, and then also you have, like my colleague said, something around like actually just an understanding of the political system itself. But belying all of that, and why education and representation matters, is because there is an underlying feeling that politics doesn't work, that it's got to the point now. And if you think about a young person living in the north, and I used to run community projects, and I worked with a lot of young people, and not just around housing, but issues around just being able to get a bus. Like, we have such an issue in terms of transport that you can't take a job in a neighbouring town because you literally can't get public transport. You can't, in some estates, you can't even get a bus to the local to your closest GP. You have to get a taxi. So you've got a failure in public transport. You've got a failure in the types of jobs that you might want that would address your living standards. A lot of low-paid, minimum wage jobs that aren't enabling people to live, and particularly young people, to live a comfortable life. And I remember going to a house where this young woman had like mould on her walls. She was trying to speak to the landlord. There's a lot of rogue landlords that have been picking up cheap houses and not doing anything to look after these homes and the living standards that people are living in was diabolical. But if there's so much that needs changing and so much that needs repairing, and there is so many issues, and if most of your voting life, if not all of your voting life, everything has got gradually worse, then the disillusionment that we're facing, and that we will face in the next election, because on top of that, you've got climate change, and the kind of the growing warnings that something must be done, and now, all of these things equate to the feeling that I just got to get up, and all I can do is survive and get myself to work and look after my kids, pay my bills, and I can't even think about politics, and I don't even believe that any politician could possibly address the issues that I'm facing, and that is one of the biggest challenges that the Labour Party is going to face, encouraging young people, because for young people we must be the party of hope. We must be the party that says we understand your concerns, we know what you are going through, and we have a plan to deliver, and we delivered before, and we will deliver again. And so everything that we do, every way that we engage, particularly to young people, it must be a message that inspires enough hope for them to believe that things can be better.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Alex to come back on that, because you're a candidate, obviously. I mean, how are you conveying to young people that hope? But also, we've got 3 empty chairs up here, so if you want to join in, if you want to contribute, just come up. Just don't ask for permission, come and take a seat, and I'll come to you in the discussion.
Yeah, I
So
think
Alex.
hope is a word, and anyone who was in the education chat earlier, I used the word hope because that's I think it's a central tenet of it, and anyone who remembers 97, that was the pervading feeling across the country, was a sense of hope. Some might say things could only get better.
Just about held off and said
And how we sell that hope to people is really, really important, because the sense that I get on the doorstep is people are fed up, people are, and I completely echo what Jessica said, because that's exactly the kind of reaction I get on the doorstep. I haven't got time to think about politics. Politics isn't for me, and breaking down that barrier so that people can I guess it's reaching them to say politics is for everyone, because it affects every single thing that's going wrong or right in your life. There's a political underbelly to it. But hope is around, I think, a few things for me. Someone said to me, I was sat in a coffee shop in Gloucester, he said, Alex, all people want is they want to have a safe birth, they want to have a good education, they want to go to a job that respects them and pays them well, they want to have a home that is clean and safe, and they want to be looked after in their old age. And when you boil it down, that's roughly what everybody wants for them or their children in their life. And actually, politics, when you boil it down to that, can seem quite simple, and it's giving people hope that that isn't an unachievable aim, that it isn't unachievable to have a house without mould, or for your kids to go to a primary school that's not failing, for our children not to go to school hungry, for there to be a bus at the end of your street that will take you into the city centre, an issue that we have down in Gloucester as well. And that should, we can tell people that what they're asking for shouldn't feel unachievable, and it isn't unachievable. We can give them that hope, but it's about having that narrative, because some of the policies we're putting out at the moment, they're great. It's pulling it all together into a narrative where we tell people there is a better future possible. You don't have to despair. You're not in this alone. We will be with you, and that, I think, is the key for how you speak to them on the doorstep and bring them along with you.
Yeah. And Unmesh, James kind of touched on it earlier, but I mean, as a young person in London, I've not got much hope, to be honest, at the moment. So for young people in London, what do you think we need to do? I know that they are mostly London, but how do we keep them?
Well, firstly, as someone who's actually got a 60-plus Oyster card, but politically is 21. So look, firstly, I'm here just to show solidarity with young Fabians. I'm actually the GMB Quality Conference around the corner, and I'm going to be there for 2 o'clock, but I said I would come along. I think, as Andrew said, that things should get better. Well, things must get better. And as our first speaker, is it Jess? It's about hope, about aspirations. I agree with everything that has already been said. So there are 5 points that I've just noted. I didn't realize I was going to make a speech, but I always like Tony Blair's 5 points sort of pledge card, the old pledge card. And about with reference to London, but I think the issues are the same, elsewhere. It's about showing, and also I would say it's why young people should vote Labour, and why hopefully they will carry on voting Labour. So if you look at the administration of Sadiq Khan, so I'm a London Assembly member with my colleague Marina here, representing City and East London, and some of the work that Sadiq is doing, which I think actually is how our Labour government sort of would work. But also what Labour councils are doing. I represent Bark and Dagenham. I'm a big fan of the work that Darren Rodwell does and the council does. But also, when I was a councillor in Newham for 20 years, I think reference was made to rogue landlords. Well, the way to beat modern day mechanism is by having a register of landlords, a licensing scheme. We introduced the country's first licensing scheme and I was a cabinet member for crime and enforcement, so part of a team, not on my own, I would say. Where we had to register a database of every single property rented out in Newham, how many bathrooms, how many toilets, how many rooms, and also backed up by a vigorous enforcement policy. Because good practice schemes don't mean anything if you actually don't actually make sure they implement it properly. Free school meals, which is the sort of stuff that appeals to aspirational families. And that's what my socialism is all about, aspirational socialism. Using the leverages of the local state as a councillor, the same thing nationally, how you open up life chances, opportunities for people to stand up on their own feet and help themselves. Our role is to help people. As I say in Dagenham, we don't want a handout, we want a hand up. So the 5 points that I would say in terms of inspiring young people to vote, to support Labour, whether in London or in the North or anywhere, and I actually spent some years in Yorkshire when I first came to this country. Housing is a big thing. It's not rocket science. Unless the supply outmatches demand, we'll always have a housing crisis. And we've got to show the vision that the old Labour London County Council did in the 50s, the predecessor of the GLC, and then the GLA came over. That people accused them of not creating communities and so on when they built new towns like Stevenage and Harlow and Hatfield. I mean, I actually had a friend, I've lost touch with him now, who grew up in Somerstown, which was a slum area in those days. Now you couldn't buy a one-room flat there for less than £700,000. When they moved to Hatfield, they actually had an indoor toilet for the first time, a little garden, a little bit of greenery. And the LCC had the vision to set up all these new towns, to rebuild sort of Londoners after the war and so on. And I think it's that sort of national house building program that we need, where supply actually outmatches demand. Otherwise, we'll always have a housing crisis, and little bits here and there don't help at all. It's a nationally led scheme that we did. So housing, and that's the one thing that I think we could offer to young people. When I actually, sort of in the 80s, banks were dying to give you a mortgage. You could actually buy a house. And of course, the bank of mum and dad, that helped me in those days to get a deposit. But that's simply not possible now. Brexit and internationalism. Young people, certainly in London anyway, where my political experiences are, but the failure of the government to negotiate trade deals, everything, the Brexit project has now been exposed for what it was, and so it's that sort of sense, a hope for the future. And also, if we are not a part of internationalist party, we are nothing. We've always been an internationalist party, and I think to young people growing up, it's a future. There's a world out there waiting to be changed, and we are part of a global movement, and Labour should always have that inspiring internationalist vision, ethical foreign policy, which Robin Cook talked about when we came to power in 1997, which I think has been echoed by some shadow cabinet ministers recently. National skills and jobs and sort of training programs, again something to appeal to young people. Climate change, what Sadiq is doing at City Hall. He's not been himself popular in many parts of outer London, but ULEZ. Yes, there is a big debate about ULEZ. There's a climate crisis and there's also economic crisis. How do you get the right balance? 10,000 Londoners are dying every year, more probably, because of air pollution in London. But what we've got to offer on climate change and our vision, something that Tories simply don't have an answer to. And I'll finish on this note, a vision for the future. Internationalist, progressive, inclusive. We are a multiracial, multicultural society. We now got, unlike when I grew up politically in the 70s and 80s, when we had the far right, all over the country. I mean, the National Front in the 1977 GLC election, which I remember, I was just coming to politics, were the third party in London. Now, 40 years on, we had the BNP in my area in 1994. Came within 55 votes of getting Britain's first fascist councillor elected. And then the Isle of Dogs actually did elect a BNP councillor. You couldn't imagine that in the modern London and in many parts of the country now. So yes, everything to fight for. The future is ours, the future is bright, the future is Labour.
Thank you, Anesh. So, Chris, in a minute, I want to ask you, do you agree with the premise of this? Are young people actually Labour? But before I do, we've had some new people come in. Again, I'm going to keep on repeating this. We've got empty seats here. If you want to contribute, if you want to say something, you don't have to be elected or an expert. Just come up and sit down and I'll ask you. All right?
So, I'll go to
Thank you, Anesh.
Call off my union, the GMB.
Join the GMB. I'll also agree with the point on ULIS as well. Like, I'm not going to lie to you, I was prouder of Sadiq Khan this week than I have been in a very long time. And you know what? ULIS isn't always going to be popular, and you know there are going to be issues, but politics is about choices, and there are quite often difficult choices. And if you're going to oppose every single measure that tries to bring down air pollution in London, then I'm sorry, but that is going to lead to more kids growing up with ineffective lungs. And I think it's about time we stood up to the Tories in London by saying that. I'll run through sort of both points of this question very quickly, because ultimately this is true, and it's a phenomenon that's been going on for some time. We speak a lot in this country about the class divide and the fact that Labour is no longer doing well a lot among people who us pollsters in our sort of very odd way, which doesn't really keep up with modern Britain anyway, describe as working class, have been moving away from the Labour Party towards the Conservative Party. And that's talked about quite a lot, and I actually don't think is quite often as interesting as substantive as people think. But what we don't talk about much is that age has increasingly become the biggest dividing line in British politics, and that's been true ever since 2010. If you were to try and work out how someone was going to vote in this country, there is no better variable you could use anymore than their age. There's almost nobody under the age of 25 who says that they'd vote Labour, vote Conservative, and at least at the last election, there were very few people over the age of 75 who said that they'd vote Labour. So what are the things that are causing this? Well, one thing it isn't particularly is economic values. So actually on questions like renationalisation or redistribution, young people aren't any more left-wing, and in many cases are less left-wing than their older counterparts. So it's definitely not that. Obviously it's the fact that they're more socially liberal, that's been talked about quite a bit. They care about different issues, they care more about climate change. Young people care more about climate change and they care less about immigration, for example. They're using different media platforms. You'll very rarely walk past a 19-year-old who's reading the Daily Mail, but they do get their news from places like Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, etc., which are more likely to be giving them young people left-wing content. Now, those are the arguments that I think are used and rehearsed quite a lot, but the most important one of all, which clearly trumps all of those, is that young people in particular have been completely screwed by the Tory government over the past 13 years. And if you look at the starting salaries which people coming out of university, young graduates, or people, particularly young people who haven't gone to university, salaries have just not gone up, and in many cases have gone down. Meanwhile, house prices have gone completely through the roof. You'll very, very rarely find someone in their 20s, myself included, who has any savings in the bank. And that's obviously completely different to what you're seeing from older generations. And that's the biggest driver, based on all of the data, for why people are moving towards the Labour Party. And I think this plays into the class debate that we were talking about before, because actually, it used to be the case that working class people were much more economically insecure than middle class people who identified as those things. And that was one of the reasons, one of the major reasons why working class people always backed the Labour Party. Now, actually, the biggest driver of economic insecurity is age, and we're still seeing that trend where the more economically insecure young people are backing the Labour Party. Now, is this the second part of the question? Will this carry on? I can't really see a path, given that the Tories are still doing absolutely nothing to try and win back young voters. I can't see a path in the next between now and the next general election when young voters move back away from the Labour Party and towards the Conservatives. But I do think it's the case that we can't, if we do win the next election, and I hope to God that we do, if if we do win the next election, we can't remember the people that will have got us there, and that's the working age population, particularly young people, who will have got the Labour Party over the line. We can't forget them, and we can't end up putting forward policies that end up improving their lives and solving this problem about economic insecurity. So 3 things in particular. We need a big, bold policy on childcare. Secondly, we need real action on climate change, not just words. And thirdly, we just need to build some more bloody homes. And I think they're the 3 things that I want to be seeing the next Labour government doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Hey, Marina, you've made a lot of notes. So what have you thought so far about what we've heard?
First of all, hello. I'm Marina Ahmad. I'm the London Assembly member for Lambeth and Southwark. So you've been really well served by the London Assembly in this particular. So somebody else here who works for the London Assembly. There you go, James. Now, I'm not going to pretend on any level whatsoever to be a young person. I was once, but I do have some accreditation for this. I am the mother of 2 young people. And what I have found, and obviously as a politician, I've been a parliamentary candidate at various points, and continuously door knocking and speaking to people. And I actually make a beeline for young people, because I know that, and I can't remember who it was that said that often that it becomes a habit. If you start voting at 18, then you're more likely to carry on voting. Now, just a slight anecdote, my eldest, the very first time she ever got to vote, and very few people I think get to say this, she actually got to vote for her mum, who was standing for Parliament at the time. She did take a photo of the ballot paper illegally, you're not allowed to do that apparently, just to prove to me that she did actually vote for me. It is really important that young people understand why Labour is the party for young people. And the list that I was making as we were going through it, it's about relevance. What is relevant about Labour to young people's lives? And what really, really bothers me, it bothers me all the time when I knock on people's doors or stop them in the high street and they say, well, why should I vote Labour? But more than that, why should I vote at all? What difference is it going to make to my life? And it's about having that conversation and making people understand why, A, they're in the situation that they're in at the moment, because actually at that point most people don't care, because the difficulties that they are facing supersede anything else that they might be thinking about. But secondly, why a Labour government would make the difference to them. And young people in particular, so I have had, a young black woman said to me, well, why should I vote Labour? You don't represent me, you don't represent my family, you don't represent the community that I come from. And here is a nugget of truth, because the front bench, and she actually said this, front bench of the Tory party actually looks far more representative of what I want you to show me than you do as a front bench. Now, the Tories have actually done this really well in terms of diversity. They've done it for absolutely the wrong reasons, of course, because we are the party of equality, but they look like the party of equality. And that goes a long way in a society where so much is on screen these days, where so much is about what you see in front of you. So I think that's something that we as a party need to look at in terms of, when we're selecting, why are we selecting in the way that we are, and who we're selecting as well. And that really is important. The relevance of policies. So young people, I think, have been really, really badly hit. We've heard about housing, we've heard about the wider economic issues, but actual policies that have been targeted at making young people's lives harder, getting rid of the education maintenance grant. I'm not even going to go into the issues around interest rates and student grants, which are just absolutely ridiculous. The lack of skills and apprenticeship training. We heard this morning about a high-skilled economy actually making that growth happen. Well, of course, this government and the coalition government, when it first came in 2010, have actually not had any interest in doing that whatsoever. So there is a whole cohort, and so many of you are much, much younger than me and know far better what I'm talking about, but a whole cohort of people who are saying, this economy, this country isn't working for me. And one of the most scary things that I found very recently was listening to the statistics about young junior doctors who are going through their training and are planning to leave to go to other countries where they feel that they'll be far more appreciated. Their skills and their abilities will be far more developed than they are in this country, which is it's really scary for this country in a few years' time in terms of that brain drain that will be happening. In the past, we've talked about brain drains in other countries, in countries that aren't developed. That's happening here in the UK. Real concern for me is about young women and about young women voting Labour and why young women should be voting Labour. Very much in the headlines in the last year, sadly, has been the issue of violence against women and girls. But every single woman in this room knows that it isn't an issue that's just happened over the last few years. We know that on average, 3 women in this country are killed by men every week. Every week, 3 women die at the hands of men because of violence. And that has been going on forever. When I was 17, I was threatened with rape by a man who decided to follow me home from the Saturday job that I did. And because I was polite, I went into a phone box, and we had phone boxes in those days. They're these big, these big red-billed little boxes that you picked up the phone, pre-mobile phone days, because I thought I'd let him pass. Of course, what he did was open the door and start threatening me and telling me what I was going to get. And I was very, very lucky that I knew where to kick and was able to go. Ended up at the police station, told the police officer, the desk sergeant, male desk sergeant at the time, that this what had happened to me. I kid you not, he literally looked me up and down at what I was wearing and effectively said, well, it's your fault. I would like to think that never, ever happens, and that is an experience that no woman, and particularly young woman, would ever have in a police station now. But I can't say that with my hand on my heart, because we hear too often how the criminal justice system fails women continuously. And if you come from a black, Asian and minority ethnic community and you are a woman, you are far more likely to be failed by the system. We just have to look at the statistics. So as a party, we've been really, really clear about what we are going to do to change those statistics. And it is about getting that message to young women that actually there is a difference here and we are different and it will not be the same under us. But when that happens, when we get into power, I will be keeping eyes and making sure that goes through, because I don't want my daughters or anyone else's daughter to go through the kinds of experiences that I've had to go through and the kinds of experiences that generations of women and girls before me have had to go through. And finally, the thing, penultimately, somebody spoke about education in schools. It's something that I have been banging on about forever. I get really tired of meeting people who have no idea about politics, or they turn around and say, oh, politics isn't for me, it doesn't affect my life. And I think there is room in the curriculum already, but if not, I think as a government we should make room for the whole issue about political education. Now, there's a difference. I think people get scared because they think, oh, you're talking about political indoctrination. It's not. It's about what we as residents, as citizens, have as a civic duty in terms of what we do. How do we register to vote? Why is it important to vote? Why does voting make a difference to people's lives? What do the political parties stand for? And I think, again, at school, it's one of those times where you really engage people. It's an opportunity, and I don't want to see that opportunity missed. I had somebody phone me in the 2019 general election to say, I really want to vote for you, but I've got no idea what I'm supposed to do to register to vote, or even what I do. Where's the polling station? What do I do when I get there? And if you remember, the very first time you go to a polling station, unless you've been lucky enough to have family members that have taken you along, it can be quite scary to be given that bit of paper and this expectation that you will know what to do in that little booth. So I think that these are really practical things that we have a civic duty to educate young people about, because that's something that carries on. And finally, unions. So Umesh has disappeared to his GMB, to the GMB Equalities Conference. As a GMB activist and somebody who believes in another life, I am the chair of the Southern Region GMB Race Network and have been for a number of years. It's really important that I think that young people are involved in their unions, because what we've seen is a massive a lack of parity around pay and young workers. And that would go a long way to resolving so many of the issues that we've talked about. Pay people what they deserve for the work that they do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina. All right, so we've actually got some young people on the panel now, with all love. Yes.
So I don't qualify for that.
No, thank you. And again, so the room's filled up a bit. If there's an empty chair and you want to contribute, please just come up and take it. All right, you don't have to wait for permission. Sorry, I don't know your name.
Sure. It's my first time at a Young Fabians event, but I'm Aidan Sarabal, and I serve as Ditchley's politics lead. But outside of that, I also ran and do run Kanishka Narayan's campaign in the south of Wales. He's the parliamentary candidate for the Vale of Glamorgan. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to touch just briefly on campaigning, and I promise to keep it brief. So on the campaigning point, I think what we're not lacking, but what we need to kind of doubly underline is to have a clear strategy, and I'll break this into real tangible terms. Firstly, on having a targeted approach, I think what we need to do across different constituencies, across parliamentary candidates, is intentionally strategize and write targeted op-eds, both in local media but also national media pieces, by helping each other to ensure that we get a firm, coordinated policy approach, one that we can then work across constituencies rather than seeing it as a kind of competition on ex-parliamentary candidate wants to have a profile on X strategy. And then the other aspect is on advertising and data. So as was already excellently kind of mentioned, on the kind of data point, young people do not just simply use traditional forms of media, though they still do. They also use social media and other forms. But in terms of engaging them, it is clear that young people, according to kind of evidence, do overwhelmingly vote for Labour, but their turnout is low, and this is a repeated issue we always come across. We try to fix every election. So we need to best think and work together and discuss in a continued conversation outside of this too, how we can work on increasing that turnout. Do we need to have more kind of events and attend more kind of colleges or schools or other further education, or attend different workplaces? And finally, I want to just highlight on the kind of campaigns and approaches, I think we can do a bit more on the coordination front. And I refer back to this specifically because we could work more across different institutions, across different factions within our party, but also other trade unions, to work on getting more campaigners from different parts of the country to different constituencies, as was referred to kind of earlier in the day on the kind of Milton Keynes just being half an hour away from London. And I think we can do a bit more here, and I would be keen to hear people's thoughts on how we can actually best tangibly get to that. That's all. Thank you.
Right, I'm going to be a bit mean because I know we've got about just under 10 minutes left. Can people limit it to 1 minute, if that's all right?
Hi, I'm Oliver. I study politics and international relations at the University of York, and this is my first time at the conference as well. So I think Labour as a party, well, obviously it is primarily socialist and there are liberal elements. I think as a whole it mostly represents and acts as a party that tries to say tomorrow will be better, we'll have a better future, better prospects. And I think a big area of why young people don't get into politics and why we see such low turnout is because the options around higher education are so limited. I'm not just talking about universities, but I think there is not enough apprenticeships and similar kind of vocational training at a higher level. But also at universities, there's not enough talk, I think, by any party about maintenance loans, about tuition fees, and about the increasing student homelessness at universities. And I think that really turns off young people because that is primarily what's going on in their lives, either trying to get into the workforce and trying to get into education, which is a very crowded area, as we've seen in the past couple of years, or are actively at university and are struggling to eat, or are struggling to study, are struggling to live. And I think that really turns people off to politics when they don't hear solutions to those problems. And while, of course, you need to address all areas of the voter base, not addressing it for young people means that they never get into politics in the first place and stay out of it for the rest of their lives. And then I think, secondly, quickly...
You're already over your minute.
Okay,
I'm really sorry.
Yeah,
I've been told we've got 5 minutes.
Yeah,
okay? So, introduce yourself.
I'm Tom. I'm the Secretary of Brighton and Hove Young Labour, and this is my first conference. And I think all I want to say really is that I think the main message of Labour's next campaign, the main message they've got to send to young people is a message of hope. And I think there's a real sort of divide between the generation that can kind of have political awareness of the last Labour government and the ones that are slightly younger and only really have knowledge of the Tory government. I think there's a bit of there's a bit of sort of hopelessness from those young people who, yeah, as I said, can't remember the last Labour government. And I think really what they need is that's what they need, a message of hope. And I think that's what, if Labour does win the next election, I think that's really what they've got to go forward with, and they've got to invest in youth service, invest in schools, because otherwise I think we run the risk of people either going straight to the Tories or refusing to vote altogether.
Yeah, that is always the big problem, actually getting people to come out.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Owen, 1 minute, please. What do you think?
Okay. Sorry, I'm Deputy Regional Coordination Officer on the Young Fabians Exec. One thing I want to raise is that, and some people have kind of addressed this, part of the reason it currently looks like most young people overwhelmingly vote Labour is turnout amongst young people is lower. There is a right-wing, potentially youth out there, even if the Tories are actively pushing it away at the moment by refusing to do anything for young people, quite the opposite. And that is, if they don't wise up, then I think some other right-wing party will. So there will be a right-wing vote amongst our generation in the future, and they will be best placed to win over people of a generation who do currently vote Labour than the Tories are. Currently, we need to limit that. And tie into what Marina's said, I think one thing we need to do with that is, and also head off people going to the Greens and Lib Dems, is to get people into unions to learn about how the right way to deal with the issues is. And I mean, my union branch is young members officer. Young people mostly don't join unions even in the same workplaces at the same rate as old people do, and we need to turn that around. We need policies not just to increase collective bargaining as we're doing.
Sorry, Owen, you've gone nearly double. But
Sorry.
thank you.
Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. All right, and very last contribution, because I'm conscious of time.
Yeah, I'll be very quick, Chair. Hi, I'm Ahmed Mahboob. So I'm a very new Fabian member and also recently became the councillor for White Hart Lane. So I think to solve this problem, we have to answer the first bit of it first, getting young people to vote. In my ward, I saw a very downward trend of people voting in general, but young people especially. So I think my ask to all of you is making sure you get involved early and making young people get involved early, even on the doorstep. Be like, oh, have you thought about joining the Labour Party or getting involved with the CLP? I think it's a big thing to do. And it is I think when I first joined my CLP, it was just full of older people, so it was a bit weird going in there. But I think having kind of a friendly face there really does help. So I'd say fix the first part first, and then the second part will follow.
All right, thank you. Perfect time. Thank you everyone for coming. This was a big experiment on my part. I'm trying to take a German idea to the UK. So thank you for bearing with. I hope you all learned something, and I hope to see you all at Young Fabian events in future. We do a hell of a lot within the Fabians, so please check us out. Thank you.
Thank you, yeah.